Just giving you a minute to add folks in here, Alex. But I can get started whenever you're ready. Okay, Alex, should I go ahead and get started?
Yep.
Oh, I'm in.
Hi.
Hi, guys. Hello. Sorry, it took me a while to get in.
We really appreciate you joining us. Just given the appreciating the limited amount of time in your busy schedule, we'll go ahead and get started here. Just quick house cleaning. My name is Derek Thomas, Senior Fiscal Policy Analyst at FPWA, and I'll be moderating. Jennifer will kick things off, and then the response team and our members and allies on the front lines will present some of our policy options, and then if there's time, we'll do Q&A. Audio is off, so for folks joining, please use the chat to submit questions. The webinar will be recorded, and we'll do our best to follow up with the Congress member on any unanswered questions. Jennifer?
Good afternoon, everyone, and I want to thank you for joining the Federal Response Team for today's conversation with Congresswoman Meng, one in a series of conversations with elected officials that we've been having over the last several weeks, where we aim to ensure that the voices and the experiences of the people most affected by federal social policies are heard. As all on this call know and very well appreciate, vulnerable populations are increasingly struggling to realize economic prosperity here in the city and all across the nation. The current COVID-19 pandemic crisis has not only challenged low-income communities and persons of color and immigrants with respect to health, but it's also exacerbated the economic hardships that they face. If we needed evidence of such, we just need to look at the data that tells us that low-income individuals, immigrants, and persons of color have been hardest hit by job losses resulting from COVID-19. And also recent reports that suggest that more than half, that the majority of Black Americans today are now unemployed. And if we dig deeper into the experiences, let's just say with Black Americans in as the tragic deaths of Floyd, the death of Aubrey, the death of Taylor, as all of these, in addition to the thousands of others, demand that we dig deeper. We know that COVID-19 is just laying bare what we've known for, I'm not going to say years, I'm not going to say decades, for centuries, that racism persists and the path to economic prosperity for all is not only not guaranteed, but made almost impossible by structural and institutional systems, practices, and policies that keep certain people from getting ahead. So, this is what this is all about, calling out these issues and trying to figure out what is the way forward by way of federal policies, legislation, and practices that creates economic prosperity for all. I want to thank you all for being here today as we confront these issues and as we offer policy solutions. The Federal Response Team includes, you may see their faces, or you will in a short while, they're going to speak, but it includes human service organizations and faith communities, policy experts that are working together to protect and strengthen federal human services programs and policies that support low-income individuals, families here in New York. Together, they represent more than 3 million New Yorkers who every day are struggling. We're honored to have this briefing with you, Congresswoman Meng. You are a native here in Queens, and you're a proven champion of policies that are resulting in systemic change for our most vulnerable populations. And we're so thankful for your role on the Appropriations Committee. We hope that we continue to build this relationship, especially given that New York, revenue-wise, gives more than we receive in funding from the federal government. So important to have you on that very powerful committee. We thank you for being on the front lines, especially during these last several months as we look to ensure greater relief for New Yorkers. So thank you so much. What we're going to do this afternoon is hear from members of the federal response team on the policy issues that we believe, that we find are critical for Congress to act on immediately. We look forward to hearing your comments, Congresswoman Meng, and then having as much as we possibly can in the next little while, a productive conversation. So thank you for being here, and thank you to the others for being here.
Is it my turn?
It is.
Thank you, Jennifer.
You're welcome to respond.
Thank you. Thanks, Jennifer, for your words, for convening us. Some of us have met before. I think all of us in some capacity work together, or at least our teams do. And I wanted to take this opportunity to say thank you to each and every one of you for literally taking care of the needs of our constituents, not only during this coronavirus pandemic, but throughout the years and days as well. I know that you are trusted voices and resources for my constituents, and I'm really thankful. And I'm thankful for this opportunity because it's such a unique time in our country, in our history. New York State, as you know, has really suffered through this coronavirus pandemic. I was on Capitol Hill, I think it was last week, all the days are blending, as we hit the approximately 100 days of coronavirus hitting our land. And it was also about the same day where the deaths of Americans got up to 100,000. And I realized that 20% of those deaths approximately were from our home state of New York. And you all know better than I do how hard hit some of our communities have gotten, have really suffered. Our Black and Brown communities, at least in Queens, have died, I think, at like twice the rate as any other ethnicity. We had even seen in the early days where we were getting instructions from the federal government, from the city, from the state, for example, to safely quarantine. But a lot of that information, even in the early days, did not even reach our most vulnerable communities. These are folks who didn't have access to multilingual documents or information. Even if they did, many of them were working 2-3 jobs, possibly living in overcrowded housing. And so many of these stories and essential workers, so many of the stories or the directives that we were given, about safely quarantining, for example, that was an unattainable luxury for so many of the people you serve and so many of my constituents. And so from day one, it's just been heartbreaking to be with you all on the ground. And I love your name, Federal Response Team. I wish Congress was a more active federal response team. And I'll put myself in that category too. They move too slow. But from day one, we really realized that government did not have all the solutions. Government could not provide all the answers. And government, frankly, moved too slow. I feel like during this pandemic, we were literally listening to our constituents, almost trying to legislate from the ground up, from small businesses to immigrant communities to minority communities, telling us what they needed and what they needed Congress to do. And in this really tough and complicated time in our country right now, we were already dealing with the coronavirus. And in the last few weeks, in the last month, we've seen and heard about fellow Americans being killed because of the color of their skin. And as we commemorated the life of George Floyd yesterday, we have tried to become as allies as someone who's not African American, who's not Black, who is trying to be a better listener and a more effective and more responsive legislator. We are needing to have a lot of tough conversations in our communities right now, and a lot of them are, you know, between shared communities that might literally live and work next to each other, but might not have had these conversations before. You know, I will say in the past few months, when Asian Americans were really suffering from a lot of discrimination, from verbal harassment, even going out to the supermarket, to physical assaults, many leaders from other communities, whether that's the Black community, Hispanic community, Jewish community, they stood loud and they stood strong with our Asian community. And so now it is part of our responsibility to have these tough conversations with people in our community about the importance of standing up for each other, not just at rallies, but also to effectuate, you know, policy and legislative changes. So I look forward to collaborating with you on all of that. You know, I think as we're talking about the coronavirus, and obviously we can talk about other stuff as well, we really saw through the early bills that Congress got signed into law that they were good pieces of legislation helping a lot of American people. But what we saw here on the ground in Queens, and likely in some of your organizations too, were that a lot of our constituents still weren't getting any real help from the bills that Congress passed, even though Congress had passed multiple bills. One of the most obvious pieces was the cash stimulus payments, where if you had a social number, you were able to get assistance. But if you didn't have one, or even if you were married to someone who didn't have one, you weren't able to get help from the bills that Congress passed. Same thing for our small businesses. The bills have been refined and improved and hopefully become more transparent as to where the help went. But especially in the early weeks, you know, we weren't hearing the usual cries for help from constituents where it's like, you know, help me process the bureaucracy and things like that. It was that they couldn't reach anyone. They couldn't even apply. They couldn't even apply to be rejected for some of these small business loans, like the PPP loans. So we saw early on how a lot of the infrastructure and the systems that are already in place put our communities at a disadvantage. So I want to thank you and many of the people that you serve, because your voices were the ones that weighed in and told us, okay, help's not really reaching the people. How do we do better? And so I won't go down the list. You know what the needs are, but we continue to make sure we're fighting to pass legislation like the HEROES Act. There still are too many people that are left out of the bills that Congress already passed, whether we're talking about food access and helping to connect the dots and mending the gaps where the food, some of which are plentiful around farms around the country and even in New York, aren't reaching the people who are hungry in our districts, to making sure that kids have internet access and devices, so that the 12 million students across the country who can't do their homework right now aren't being put further back through no fault at their own. So those are just some of the larger issues that our office has focused on, but happy to hear your concerns and answer questions.
Great. We'll just get right into it, and we're so glad that we deeply appreciate your efforts so far. I think I speak for the group, and that we're so glad that you'll be joining the New York Federal Tax and Budget Response Team. You enjoy the name. So I'm just going to go ahead and we're going to kick off with Ron.
Yeah, so hi, I'm Ron Deutsch. I'm the Executive Director of the Fiscal Policy Institute. Nice to see you again.
Yeah.
I just want to very briefly talk about the need for state and local relief. There's no question, you know, New York, we're looking at $61 billion in lost revenue through 2024. The governor is proposing $10 billion in cuts in this year's budget, which would be about 20% across the board cuts to education, housing, healthcare, human services, at a time when we can least afford to make those cuts. We know that counties are looking at anywhere from up to $3 billion in lost revenue as well as a result of the pause order and COVID. So I guess my question is, we really need, the money in the HEROES Act was great, but we really need to move Senator McConnell a little bit quicker, if at all. So we need that money, and we need it soon. So I'm hoping we can, get Congress moving again, and get this money out the door, so we don't have to make cuts that are going to hurt the very people that we purport to help.
Thanks, Ron. So we're just going to move through, if that's okay, and then we can respond after. Louisa?
Hi, Congresswoman. I'm Louisa Chafee. I'm with UJA Federation. Lovely to be here this afternoon. I want to amplify what you said about government not being able to do it alone. As you know, UJA is the largest community foundation in the country. And as such, we are reliant on a broad group of very generous donors. We thank Congress for its work on charitable deductions, but encourage increase of and continuation of the charitable deductions, as well as moving just from cash to other equal fiscal instruments. We really need those who still have plenty to be able to give in many ways, so that the rest of us can do critical work in helping. And I also would like to really encourage an extension of the unemployment insurance benefits. We see, while somewhat better numbers, the reality is that we do not have an economic V rebound, and we have many, many challenges. You highlighted them in your introduction remarks, and we believe that this would be a critical element to continue. So thank you.
Amy?
Congresswoman Meng, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to see you. My name is Amy Torres, Director of Policy and Advocacy at CPC, the Chinese American Planning Council. I just want to thank you again for continuing to center and affirm how hard hit many communities of color are, particularly our Black and Brown communities, and how far behind many of our communities have been left in the responses, the federal response packages so far. As an immigrants' rights organization and a social services organization dedicated to social change, CPC knows that many of the immigrant families, in addition to being left out of relief, are left out of a lot of the numbers, including numbers reported by ICE for infection rates in detention centers. We know that the HEROES Act includes some language to require mandatory release of immigrants who are not kept under mandatory detention, but we know that ICE has also been a little bit slippery and not as transparent in the number of cases and the number of deaths that have happened in detention, or deaths that happen soon after release. We know that there is legislation, the Federal Immigrant Release and Safety and Security Together Act, which would provide additional onus onto ICE and CBP to halt enforcement and to not resume enforcement for individuals released once the crisis is over. We would love to hear your thoughts on co-sponsorship and how we prevent this spread that's happening in detention centers and the continued terror of ICE that is raining on our communities.
Thank you, Amy. Just to do a quick time check, we have 3 more presenters to go. I wanted to make sure, just want to check with you, Congresswoman, to see if we should resume, or if you wanted to respond right now. If you need to jump off the line, we understand.
Yeah, that's fine. Let's just go through the remaining questions, and then I'll try to answer. And I'm taking notes, so I'll remember the questions.
Great. So again, yeah, and I'm Derek Thomas again, Senior Fiscal Policy Analyst at FPWA. Appreciate all the work. Just 2 ways which we believe that the HEROES Act could be strengthened, and learning lessons from the Great Recession is ensuring that we tie unemployment insurance to the economic conditions in each additional state, instead of having that arbitrary cutoff. And the same way with the cash assistance checks, following the proposal from Senator Booker that increases them to $2,000 and also ties them to the economic conditions on the ground. And now I will kick it off to MJ.
Hey, good afternoon, Congresswoman. My name is MJ Okaba with the Human Services Council. I wanted to thank you for your strong support for frontline workers and fighting hard to secure pay increases for essential workers through the HEROES Act. A strong human services sector with a protected and fairly paid workforce is necessary for New York's continued COVID-19 response and recovery. They're out there every day providing food, resources, and support in communities that have been impacted the hardest by this pandemic due to structural racism, ableism, and income inequality. Due to underfunded government contracts and a historic disinvestment from New York State, which has cut funding for human services by 26% since the Great Recession, these workers are some of the lowest paid workers in New York's economy. They're a majority people of color, and they have been putting themselves and their family at risk during this pandemic. And the current ill-planned curfew in response to the protest is actively compounding their trauma and making their jobs harder. Retroactive incentive pay to the start of this pandemic in New York and support for these workers continues to be an urgent priority of the human services sector. Thank you so much for your support on this issue.
Hi, Congressmember Meng. This is Nick Hughes from the, this is Nick from the Food Bank for New York City. We work with over 30 emergency food providers in your district alone and hundreds more across the city. I want to thank you for fighting for investments in the nutrition assistance programs that our communities rely on, and in particular, the letter that you led to the White House to make these programs stronger. For food banks, continued investment in the Federal Emergency Food Assistance Program, including support for operations, storage, and distribution, will continue to be essential to providers. But we also know that emergency food is only a small portion of the way that people across the country and in your district access the food that they need. So we want to urge you to continue to fight for benefit sufficiency for SNAP in the way that's outlined in the HEROES Act, which is increasing benefits across the board by 15% and increasing the minimum benefit from $16 to $30. So thank you again for all the work that you're doing in the food space. I'll stop there.
Okay, and then we just have Maria, and then after that, Yolanda.
Hi, thank you, Congressmember, for joining us today. I'm Maria Lizardo, Executive Director of a settlement house called Nimic. We serve Upper Manhattan and the west side of the Bronx. And I just wanted to tell you Casilda's story, who is undocumented and part of the 25% of undocumented folks who are extremely rent burdened. She's part of our worker cooperative, and since the middle of March has not been able to work. She's not eligible for the federal stimulus or unemployment. So she owes rent for the months of May, June, and we know that the rent moratorium in New York State will expire in August, but she has not been able to work, and it will take her a lot of time to get on her feet. And this is the story of many New Yorkers who are rent burdened. About 50% are rent burdened as of right now. And so $100 billion for rental assistance would be really instrumental and key in keeping people housed, because we expect a tidal wave of evictions. And unless we find ways to support New Yorkers, talk about homelessness, we will see it. Thank you.
Thank you, and good afternoon, and thank you, Congresswoman Meng, for your advocacy for the communities and organizations that serve and support those communities. My name is Yolanda McBride. I'm Director of Public Policy at Children's Aid, a multi-service human service organization in New York City. And I want to talk to you about the childcare industry, which is really struggling right now. We are deeply concerned about whether or not this industry will exist when the state fully reopens and more parents go back to work. Particularly parents in lower income communities who will go back to work sooner than other parents. Extended closures have really forced nearly half of the childcare providers across the state to close their doors, and those still operating are operating at reduced capacity as a result of social distancing requirements, further straining recovery. We have some data published several weeks ago that shows a typical childcare center in New York State is seeing their revenue drop to 62% of pre-pandemic revenues. And without deep public investment, our providers will essentially have two options: raise tuition, particularly for private pay families, or close their doors. And our analysis indicates that we need $50 billion to assist states like New York to reopen and have these critical services available for our families. You know, childcare is really a part of the safety net, and we are hopeful, I'm sorry for that, hopeful that with the support, the childcare industry will survive the pandemic. So thank you so much for the time to address this important issue.
Thank you. Are those all the questions? So I'm going to try to address them all briefly at least, and please, feel free to loop in with us on more specifics or actionable items. We're happy to continue the conversation. So in terms of, I'll go backwards actually, Yolanda, I just wanted to flag, and you might know this already, the Women's Caucus, Democratic Women's Caucus, this is one of their top priorities. There are some pieces of legislation that are being drafted or worked on. There was a Zoom a few days ago with some of the leading voices. So please, if we can help connect you or to make sure that your voices are part of the conversation about the bills that are being put together, just let us know. But this is a real concern. You are right. And I don't think that society in general, I know there's lots to worry about, but we're not realizing the full potential impact of this topic yet. For the state and local, I agree. Look, this is something that is top priority for New York. I won't get into what New York State should do and who they should tax. You all are already part of those important conversations. But this is something that it's one of the issues in this coronavirus pandemic that Republicans across the country are supportive of. I don't know why and where Mitch McConnell is so hesitant on being a leader on this, because his own Republican mayors across the country are begging for this. They are mayors of small towns and cities, unlike New York, who might not necessarily get federal funding. So they literally would depend on this money to recover from this pandemic. And so what we've been talking to with some of our colleagues across the country, the Governors Association, the I forgot the official name, Conference of Mayors or whatever it is, trying to get them and their Republican colleagues to weigh in with Mitch McConnell. This is obviously important to New York, but we have plenty of supporters for their own reasons to help push for this. We have to get the stories out. There is public support for this, and it's helpful. So we'll keep pushing on that. Second, we talked about extension of unemployment benefits. Yes, we would love to see that. We know that I think it's like over 40 million Americans have already applied for uninsurance, and those are just the people that were able to get through. And there are many people still living in the shadows or who aren't able to apply or get the funds yet. So definitely whatever we can do, we'll continue to thank you for the reminder on that. For nonprofits, I just want to highlight this as one example of why it's so important for leaders like yourselves and your members to weigh in. This wasn't necessarily part of the first round of or first version of the CARES Act or bills that were being put together, but because we heard so overwhelmingly, I know CPC weighed in, I know a lot of groups weighed in directly with us. It's important for us to continue to hear your voices. So you guys made that happen. And Amy's question, someone reminded me that, and I didn't confirm these statistics, but someone reminded me the other day that 80% of New York City were women or people of color, right? And then I reminded myself and the people on our Zoom that 80% of Congress are men. And the diversity percentage of that 80% is probably not super high. And so as we're talking about prioritizing legislation and issues, it is up to us, it is up to you and I to make sure that our different levels of government, like the 80%, no offense to the men in the room, you're all doing your part, but making sure that they're prioritizing and including even, not just prioritizing, including and even remembering the needs of women and communities of color, which are so affected here in New York. I will take a look at that bill, Amy. I haven't fully read it yet. I know through an appropriations standpoint, we've had a hearing, we've written multiple letters about this issue, urging release of detainees who are either low risk, old age, who might have comorbidities, etc. And as you know, so we'll take a look at that bill and get back to you. But as you know, it's not even just the detention centers, it's also the prison system. you know, I have been talking to some public defenders around the city, and even the ones who were, who have been detained because of the curfew laws, they are not being processed. They're being processed at like a few people per night. So they are staying in there a lot longer than they need to be. And these are just a few people, the people in the last few days that have been detained in our local prison system. So just to, you probably know the issue, but I'm just hearing, you know, I had one lawyer tell me she was scheduled to work a 6-hour shift and she processed 2 people during that 6-hour shift. And there's no reason for that slow pace. And so we will continue to push on those 2 fronts. For SNAP, you know, look, I haven't been in government that long. I just think that there's got to be a much more efficient and common sense way to get food, plentiful food around the country, into the hands and families of people here in New York and people in our most needy and vulnerable communities. And we have seen this really demonstrate the need during this pandemic, where many things have changed, you know, conditions have gotten better, but the number of people who have needed food and who are asking for food, people who traditionally have never gone or asked for help for food, those numbers are only increasing. The lines are only getting longer. And so how do we make sure that we are doing a better job at utilizing the SNAP program, expanding, you know, so, you know, for example, one of the things that I pushed was to allow SNAP benefits to be used to purchase hot foods, right? Like if you're an essential worker, you don't have time to stand an hour or 2 at a grocery store and then go back and cook and then go back to work. There's so many things that don't make sense. They literally did this just recently for the California wildfires. So there's a lot of gaps and dots that are not being connected. So please continue to keep us in the loop on those issues that are really common sense. Frontline pay, MJ, hazard pay. Look, I think we just have to think about this differently. After 9/11, you know, we saw first responders of FDNY police rush into the towers, and they were our heroes, no doubt about that. And now, as we go through this coronavirus pandemic, we have to look back and see who were our heroes during this pandemic. They might not look conventional. They might not look the way that we think who essential workers and frontline workers usually are. But if you were told that you were an essential worker and you didn't have the luxury to stay home and you put yourself and your families at risk, you are a frontline worker. You should be getting hazard pay. It is part of the HEROES Act, which has a long list of folks included. You know, not just healthcare workers, pharmacists, grocery store workers, you know, transit operators, doormen, doorwomen. These are the people that are, someone just texted, our New York heroes. And those are the ones, after we've gone through this disaster, 20% of those killed in this United States, they should be getting the hazard pay. So I totally support that. And then I believe the last question was about rent. There are different pieces of legislation and letters going on. Representative Omar has a bill, which I'm on. Representative Maxine Waters has language to help both landlords and tenants. People cannot pay their rent. We've said this from day one. This is not just a progressive issue. I've had Republicans who don't believe in most of the policies that I believe in, but they tell me they can't pay their rent. They never expected to lose their job, and they can't pay. A moratorium will not do much good, because 3 months later, 6 months later, the money is not going to suddenly fall from the sky, especially if you've lost your job. So moratorium doesn't help people after X number of months. So we're trying to do what we can. Again, there is language in the HEROES Act that has a fund for tenants and landlords. That's fair. So again, hopefully we get that passed before we enter next housing crisis. I think I answered all the questions, but if I didn't, please feel free to reach out. We can circle back. But thank you for having me. Thank you for all you do. Please reach out. There's no issue that's too small. If you see something going on, especially if it's a pattern or a growing trend, please let us know. We need to know.
Great. Thank you so much for everyone that joined us today. And thank you so much again, Congresswoman Meng, for the relationship, we're building with you, and for your work in Congress, for your time, for staying on a little bit longer today. We really appreciate that. And of course, we stand along with you in your commitment to serve New Yorkers. If there's anything that, we'll follow up with some questions. There were some data and reports and some additional concerns that were cited in the comments section. So we'll follow up with some of that, and in addition to Amy's legislative ask. And if there's any way that we can be helpful in now or in the future, don't hesitate to reach out.
Got it. Thank you so much. Thank you all. Census and mail-in ballots. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I just want to, before I end, I know that you've all been really active. I will now go to events. Well, not anymore, but when I was going to events, when it was okay to do so, I would literally have constituents, if I didn't mention census, they would say, excuse me, you forgot to mention census. And so I want to give all of you credit, because I know that you've been hammering that message home. So,
thank you.
thank you all.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You too.